Hi, my name is Thomas Maurer and I'm a program manager at Microsoft. In this video we're going to have a look at the new Azure Stack HCI version 23H2 and how it fits in our Azure Adaptive Cloud approach. So stay tuned. Welcome back. So for those who are not familiar with Azure Stack HCI, Azure Stack HCI is our hyper-converged infrastructure solution. And that means it brings together compute, storage, and networking using standard x86 server systems and using really the magic of software for your virtualization environment. And you can basically deploy these on premises in your data centers or edge locations, and then run on top of that your virtualization workloads such as Linux and Windows virtual machines. However, it doesn't just stop there. With Azure Stack HCI, we also allow you to run and deploy cloud-native workloads running on top of Kubernetes clusters, for example with AKS or Azure PaaS services in these locations as well. And there are some other awesome benefits we will go through in that video as well, so that you can make out the most of it. Now, another big part of Azure Stack HCI, especially in 23H2, it is Azure Arc enabled, meaning that you actually can control and manage it directly from the Azure control plane. And when I say control plane, that means like different things. For example, the portal, you can also use CLI or APIs, infrastructure as code, whatever you prefer to basically run and manage this, you can do that over a centralized control plane, as if you would interact with any other Azure resources. But at this time, again, thanks to the power of Azure Arc, it's not in an Azure data center, it's basically running on your locations. So let's have a quick look how that actually looks like. So here we are in the Azure portal, and as for all the Azure Arc enabled resources and services and infrastructure, I would go to Azure Arc. And you can see here Azure Arc is not just there for Azure Stack HCI, but you also have some other services here as well, some other things you can manage. For example, here under infrastructures, you can manage your Windows and Linux virtual machines running on premises or even at another cloud provider. And the same is true for Kubernetes clusters. We can even add also your VMware environments and System Center environments, or then use our Arc enabled services to deploy these on-prem. But today, we're obviously going to have a look at Azure Stack HCI. So if you want to manage or deploy a new Azure Stack HCI cluster, you obviously hit Azure Stack HCI, and you can see here you get introduced by Getting Started guide. But in my case, I just want to have a look at all my clusters here, which I already have deployed. We're going to have a look how you deploy a new cluster a little bit later in this video. But first, let's have a look at these clusters. So here we have a set of different clusters already deployed, and we're going to have a look at this one specifically. So this allows you basically to have a look at it, and you can see here it looks like an Azure resource, right? It actually says, okay, hey, you're part of an Azure subscription, you're part of a resource group. And then you can also find some additional information here. What version of Azure Stack HCI are you actually running? Which build are you running? When is the last time that system connected to Azure? And so on. Now, on the bottom, you can already see in this big, some of the capabilities you get, some of the extras you get with Azure Stack HCI. So first of all, since we treat Azure Stack HCI as it is, like Azure, you get some of the benefits. So you can, for example, run our Windows Server Azure Edition, which is a special version of Windows Server, and take advantage of some of the features like hot patching as well, but again, running on premises or at the edge. And in 23H2, we also announced the GA of Azure Virtual Desktop running on Azure Stack HCI, meaning now you can have your node pools in Azure Virtual Desktop running on premises in your own data center. Again, and this also allows you then to run multi-session Windows 11 and Windows 10 in these locations as well. And then last but not least, I mentioned that already, you can also easily deploy now our Azure Kubernetes Service on top of Azure Stack HCI as well. So you can, like if you're modernizing your applications to container-based apps, we also give you the Kubernetes experience you get from Azure, but again, run it in your own location. And there's much more to it, right? There's much more, and we will go through some of these today, but again, a ton of features out there as well. If I click here on notes, you can see here I can actually see the physical nodes. In this case, I'm just running one node, which is a kind of like what we call one node clusters, but you can basically run from 1 to 16 node clusters, and from very small configurations with a couple of gigabytes of memory. I think mine now is running 64 gigs of memory in this case, but up to very large systems as well, right? Really depending on your needs. We also have these ruggedized solutions from different OEMs where you can basically go out and say, okay, hey, I need something really for a specific edge location, for a factory floor, for some medical device stuff as well. So you have different choices in terms of hardware as well. And I highly recommend to check out the Azure Stack HCI catalog, because that's where you can find all the solutions from different OEMs which are offered. And then again, we get some additional configuration and monitoring information, which you can have a quick view on as well. Now, I mentioned that this is part of the Azure control plane of the Azure Resource Manager. And that adds automatically a couple of benefits. Now, to manage this cluster, you see I'm logged in into the Azure portal. Now, to do that, that's the part I didn't show you, I obviously need to go through some security checks. I need to use MFA. So I'm using Microsoft Entra ID basically to log in. And now I can use the access control basically for role-based access to basically give permissions to certain groups to manage that cluster, or maybe have read-only view on that cluster as well, so they can actually manage that, right? So if I have an operations team, I can now use, similar as I would do with Azure Resources, I can create a group and basically add that, and they can start manage it directly from the Azure portal. So there's much more I want to show you today. So there's a couple of things here. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about workloads. So I mentioned you can run virtual machines on this. Again, it's a hyper-converged infrastructure solution. So with that, you can see here I have a virtual machine running. If I click on this virtual machine, you can see here I can do basic VM lifecycle management in terms of stopping, starting, restarting the machine. I can also add additional security things like Microsoft Defender for Cloud to that machine, and use Azure Arc basically also to fully manage that machine using policy, update management. So I really can like manage that virtual machine running on top of Azure Stack HCI directly from Azure as well. Now, another benefit I need to highlight here for Azure Stack HCI. If you're running Windows Server 2008, 2008 R2, 2012 or 2012 R2, you might know that these are out of support, and you would need to buy extended security updates for these specific servers. Now, we have a special offer where when you migrate these servers to Azure, you get extended security updates for free. Now, the way that we treat Azure Stack HCI as Azure, that offer also applies to Azure Stack HCI. So if you need to keep these systems running on premises or at your specific edge locations, you can basically deploy Azure Stack HCI, migrate those VMs to Azure Stack HCI, and this means you can then basically get free extended security updates for the specific system, which is another great benefit. And again, we might do another video on what all the management capabilities for these virtual machines are, but let's go back to Azure Stack HCI. Now, another big benefit here of running virtual machines on top of this, it's not just you can bring your own virtual machines, your own images, but you can also use the Azure Marketplace. So to create virtual machines, again, you can create your own images here, but if you click on this, add a VM image, you can see here you have different options. You can start from a local share. So if you have that on-prem on a share, that VHT file can be used as well. You can also store this centrally on an Azure storage account. This is especially handy when you have different sites and different locations. Could be all over the world or just in one country, but you have like all these things. You can then store this centrally, that image, in an Azure storage account. And if you create a new image, basically all your sites, all your Azure Stack HCI clusters can get that image from that storage account. And then last but not least, you get offer to have like VM images from the Azure Marketplace. So let me quickly show you that. So I can basically go and say, hey, I want to add a new image, and this one is from the Marketplace. And again, you can do certain configurations here. But one thing I want to show you, here are some of the images which we make available as part of this Marketplace integration. So you can see here, I already mentioned the Windows Server Azure Edition. So you can use these images as well. And then we have all the different kinds of like Windows 11 and Windows 10 enterprise multi-session hosts with Microsoft 365 apps or without Microsoft 365 apps. So you can basically syndicate these onto your Azure Stack HCI cluster and take advantage of it. So going back to this, obviously you can configure your networking parts and so on as well, all the things you actually need to run Azure Stack HCI. But then another thing I want to show you, it's again, as I mentioned, it's not just about virtual machines, right? You want to probably also run some modernized workloads, some containerized workloads on top of that as well. And that is where AKS enabled by Azure Arc comes in. So here you can basically see I have deployed a Kubernetes cluster directly from the Azure portal on Azure Stack HCI. Similar way as I would do that in Azure, but this time it runs in my on-premises location. So this is simple. Again, if I create a new cluster here, you can see here a wizard comes up where I can basically choose where to deploy that cluster, what's the name of this cluster. So if I select this, I can also then choose between different Kubernetes cluster versions. I can define the primary node pool, some of my admin credentials. I can then create additional node pools. And the great thing here, it's not just Windows node pools, obviously, it's also supporting and using Linux node pools. It's basically the default there as well. And then I can configure certain things like access for authentication. I can also use Microsoft Entra to basically have RBAC inside Kubernetes as well. I can select that if I want to. I can configure the networking piece here. So again, the logical network I configured, this is an on-prem network. I basically set up in the logical network part, and then I would basically configure the IP address for the control plane. I can set up monitoring if I wanted to, so I can use Azure Monitor to monitor that Kubernetes cluster as well. Can set up some tagging as I would do for other Azure resources, and then at the end I can review that deployment and actually start deploying this. Now, since I didn't fill out all the information, obviously it will not allow me to do that right now. But again, if I now look at this Kubernetes cluster, it really looks like something like you already know if you have run AKS in Azure, right? So again, you get some information here about what you're actually running. Here again, you can use role-based access control to make sure that you can set up the people for this. So if you have, for example, just a Kubernetes team, which they don't need access to the Azure Stack HCI part, but they need access to the Kubernetes cluster, you can do that nicely using the Azure control plane. And then you can do certain things here, which is really related to Kubernetes. In this case, you have monitoring pieces as well. So you can, for example, enable Azure Monitor here and get some data, for example, also on the nodes and so on the controllers and on the containers. But you can also see here, we have some additional stuff here where you can also set up, for example, GitOps to deploy and configure your applications on Kubernetes as well. So pretty good integration. Again, we could do a full video on AKS running on Azure Stack HCI, But again, I just want to show you that this capability currently exists and you can use that as well. So I showed you some of the things you can do. Again, I showed you this in the portal, but you have to understand that all the things I'm showing you in this portal, you can also leverage using the control planes, or you could do infrastructure as code. You could use CLIs and automate it using the CLI or PowerShell to basically deploy these workloads or manage these workloads as well. Now, let's have some additional things in terms of actually managing this specific HCI cluster. So if I scroll down, I have, especially on the security part, some interesting things happening. So we're working on the Microsoft Defender for cloud integration. So this makes sure that we can use the power of our Microsoft Defender solution running in Azure, but also use that on-prem. So for our physical HCI nodes, we can use that as well. But then also for the virtual machines and Kubernetes clusters on top of this, we can use that as well. So you can see here, I get some security recommendations. So you can see I probably need to deploy a couple of updates here to make sure that I'm actually secure. Then there's some other settings which are recommended to have. But it's not just about obviously recommendations. Defender is really also good, like when there are attacks, detecting these security incidents and alerts, and then basically they show up here as well. And obviously you can set up notifications for this as well. If you're not familiar with Microsoft Defender for Cloud, this is a really powerful tool which we are also bringing to the on-premises world. And then there was a lot of investment into the new version of 23H2 in terms of security. So there are a ton of different security settings. We're making sure that they're enabled by default. And you can see here, you get an overview about the settings, if they're enabled or not enabled. You can see here, you get a couple of warnings here for those things which are not running on that specific system. And so I get some guides to actually enable these if they are not turned on as well. We also integrated Windows Defender application control, so meaning that you can actually control what drivers and apps are running on the physical nodes of these systems, because that makes a lot of sense, right? You like on the Azure Stack HCI nodes itself, you don't necessarily want some third-party software or like some attacker software obviously to run, so you can really lock these nodes down to be protected. And then there are some other protection mechanisms. So it tells me that, for example, my storage volumes are encrypted, or in this case, you can see here the OS volume is not encrypted. So that is something I should probably take care of and actually fix that issue to make sure that everything is encrypted at rest, even the storage volumes are, the OS volumes are protected as well. And then the same thing for network, since Storage Space Direct is using SMB. We have SMB signing, for example, which can help you protect and encrypt traffic between the servers. So this makes sure that this is actually turned on. Now, speaking of how to monitor the system, you can also enable Azure Monitor for Azure Stack HCI. So now this means you get centralized monitoring for these Azure Stack HCI clusters. Doesn't matter where they're running, you get that in Azure Monitor. You can see here, like it tells me now that this system is completely healthy, there are no faults on that system, but I can drill down deeper and say, okay, how are my different servers doing or my different nodes doing? So in this case, I'm monitoring my node here, and you can see here I get some information on CPU usage, memory usage, network traffic, and so on. I can also monitor the state of my virtual machines. And so I get the information on the virtual machines I'm running. Is everything okay? How many virtual machines are running? Which ones are stopped? Are there any in failed state? And same thing, obviously, for storage, where you get all the information about storage volumes. Do I still have enough space? Do I need to do something? Do I have some critical errors with disks, for example? So you get that information directly within the Azure portal. And obviously, that's great to look at, but in a normal operations environment, you also want to probably set up alerts, right? So you can do that directly from this menu as well. We also give you some recommendations, like some base alerts you want to probably set up, but you can basically configure whatever you want to get these alerts, and then define how these alerts get to you. This could be like, let's say, just to name a few examples, you could send out an email, like make a notification in the apps, do a Teams message, put it into Slack, directly open a ticket in your ticketing system, for example, or build some other automation around it, where you can, for example, run some Azure Logic apps or some runbooks, basically, to like automate certain actions there, and in some cases even like directly solve the issue, right? If you know, okay, this is how you solve it, you can do that too, and you get that power of Azure Monitor. Now, again, I'm showing you this for the specific Azure Stack HCI cluster, but Azure Monitor is obviously also available for the virtual machines running on top of that, and also for Kubernetes clusters and other parts which are running there too. So there are a couple of other operational things I quickly want to mention. One of them being disaster recovery. So you can set up Azure Site Recovery, and basically this allows you to replicate your virtual machines running on Azure Stack HCI and replicate them to an Azure region. So in case your complete site fails, or your complete Azure Stack HCI cluster for some reason is not available, you can fail over the virtual machines to Azure and let them run there, so that you can continue with your business there as well, which is a great way to protect your workloads there. And then another common ask is, okay, so how do I keep this system up to date, right? I mean, if you're familiar with Azure Stack HCI before, you basically had the nodes you needed to patch. There was some management software you needed to patch. You need to patch the Kubernetes versions. So there's a lot of things happening. Now with 23H2, basically this becomes a lot easier, right? So as soon as a new update available, which is basically an end-to-end update, right? It patches the nodes, it patches all the management components, it patches the AKS setup as well. So it would show up here. And in this case, I'm already like every good admin, I already deployed the update. But in some cases, it would just show up here as available. And then you would go through and you can see what it actually is, right? You could check out the version. You would then go through some readiness checks. So we really want to make sure that you can actually deploy this update successful. So there's a ton of checks we built in to make sure everything is running as expected, so that you don't have any issues during the updates. And after that, you can then basically run the update or start the update process. And then this will go through and actually patch the different components and all that. Like if it's obviously more than a one node system, like if it's a two node system, it will do that like without downtime, right? It will move the workloads to the other node, go through patching this node, and then basically moving the workloads to the other node and doing it for the second node, and so on and so on and so on. So that makes sure that you don't have any downtime. Again, this happens from 2 to 16 node systems. Obviously for a one node system, at one point you need to only have one point of failure. So in that case, you will have some downtime, but we will obviously tell you this, as you could see in the readiness check, that you actually have here that I have only a one node solution. So that means I need to actually plan for that specific reboot when that should happen. That's a little bit more task, but if you have more than one node, this just runs through. And again, you can have that in this specific setup for this specific HCI cluster, but this also shows up in the Azure Update Manager. So you're probably familiar with Azure Update Manager. It allows you to patch your Linux and Windows Azure virtual machines, as well as your on-premises and edge virtual machines running Linux and Windows, which are enabled by Azure Arc, or even if they're running at other cloud providers, you could also basically use that to manage the patch orchestration centrally. And you can see here, get some great overview about how that works. But then new here, you can also see that I can now have or manage the updates for my Azure Stack HCI. That's basically what I just showed you for my specific cluster. But if I click on this, I can see all the clusters in my environment, and I can basically see how they are doing, right? So if, for example, I have a couple of clusters where there was an update where we had some issues. So we look at this, okay, we can have a check why that happened, but then you can also see some of the clusters which are up to date. And again, you would also see if there is an update in progress, or if there are, for example, like not applied updates as well. If they're not up to date, this would show up here. It gives you a great overview about the whole cluster set, and you don't need to think about all the different types of components as well. So let's go back to the Azure Stack HCI cluster, because there are a couple of other things I want to talk to you as well. And that being, for example, some additional configuration. Now, there's also a benefit which comes with having Windows Server already, right? So if you go to configuration, you can set up some of the billing information for that system. And usually you get charged by the physical core in your notes as a total per month in that case. But if you have already Windows Server data center licenses with software assurance, you can basically exchange these licenses and get Azure Stack HCI for free. And the same thing also applies for AKS running on top of this. So this can be a very good and cheap solution as well if you run this and basically you already are a customer running Windows Server Data Center with active software assurance. So make sure you check that out with your in the docs, and also with your licensing expert if you actually apply this, but you can then easily go and activate that as well. And then last but not least, I want to show you something which is a little bit more. So we also have the Windows Admin Center integration into the Azure portal. And if you're familiar with Windows Admin Center, it's usually something you can download, install locally, have a web-based management console to manage your Windows servers, your failover clusters, but also your Azure Stack HCI clusters. And so we basically a couple of months ago start to integrate Windows Admin Center into the Azure portal, and this also works for your Azure Stack HCI cluster. So you can see here now I can connect to my Azure Stack HCI cluster using Windows Admin Center from the Azure portal. And this will give me some additional management tooling as well. So you can see here now it's fully loaded. I get my usual dashboard here with all that information I want to know. But what's really interesting is like the settings or the extensions on the left. So you can go through a couple of these management things. Now, some of these are already in the Azure portal. Some of them are like duplicated here in the Windows Admin Center experience. But also if you have some additional network configuration tasks and so on, you can do that. Or if you look at under settings, this is where you can find some of the additional settings you can actually configure for that specific cluster as well. Again, you can still use Windows Admin Center locally. That, like, if there's something happens, if you don't have, for example, a connection to the Azure control plane and you still need to manage that, you can also use this. But you can also directly use it from the Azure control plane, which is a very secure way of managing your cluster as well. So again, we went through a couple of these things for Azure Stack HCI and had a look at how these work. You might also want to know, okay, how do I now actually deploy an Azure Stack HCI cluster? And that's fairly simple. So if you're in the Azure portal, if you're on the Getting Started page, it basically explains you what to do. So basically, you would go and choose your hardware, right? And that's what I mentioned, the Azure Stack HCI catalog, where you can directly go from a ton of different system builders and OEMs. You can basically go for the different systems here. You can select your preferred vendor. You can see here right now there's over 250 different platforms available where you can select what is right for you. And then you would basically order that directly from your OEM. In some cases, you probably already have the hardware, right? These are not some exotic kind of like things usually. These are pretty the standard systems the system builders ship. There's some specifics, obviously, because it's a hyper-converged systems. There's obviously like the disks and the storage are within these servers, so you might need a little bit more local disk storage in these. There are some certain requirements, and then there's also some, like, for example, networking features you get with specific network cards. But I highly recommend that you talk to your system vendor or solution builder, to your OEM, to ask them, okay, what hardware is right for you. Now, we are not blocking you to install it from any other things. Basically, so if you just want to do a test or try it out in your lab, that there's still some great ways to doing that. But I will talk a little bit about that, how you can try it out a little bit more. And then there's some additional things here. When you deploy it, you basically download the Azure Stack HCI OS, right? So similar as you would have with any other OS, you install that on these specific nodes. And then you basically, when you set these up, you connect them through to Azure. And then when you do the cluster deployment, you basically go to this wizard and you can basically run through this and basically configure the whole system here. So again, you would obviously need to choose a subscription, a resource group, give the cluster a name. And then on the bottom here, that is where then these enabled servers which you just connected, these physical servers which you just connected would show up. And you can then select the ones which you want to build the cluster with. And then you would run through this wizard here. You would do some basic configuration. You would configure the networking so that you know, okay, which network adapter is doing what. You configure the management, some additional security settings, which I just showed you as well. And basically you run through this and basically configure everything. This also applies to, for example, like storage and things like that as well. And at the end, you get a configuration file, which you can then basically use to also reuse, basically, to deploy other clusters as well, right? So you don't always have to go through the full experience. You could really automate that process to have that like kind of like as an infrastructure as code approach here as well. So again, Azure Stack HCI, great solution for your on-premises and edge environments to like run your virtualization workloads and your cloud-native workloads as well, and then manage them directly from the cloud through the Azure Arc enablement and get all the benefits basically you can get from the Azure cloud. Now, if you want to try this out, it's also an absolutely great way using the Azure Arc Jumpstart. In the Azure Arc Jumpstart, we basically allow you to deploy HCIBox. And HCIBox allows you to deploy a very large virtual machine in Azure as a sandbox environment. It automatically sets up inside of that a virtual Azure Stack HCI cluster, and then with all the different pieces to it. Similar as I showed you here with now physical hardware, it would just use the same thing with virtual hardware, and you can really go in and try it out and figure out, okay, is this something I want to have as well. So this was a short overview about Azure Stack HCI version 23H2. I hope this was helpful. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and see you in the next one.